Welcome to Sociology 336, the sociology of work and technology. This is week 11, and we're going to talk about how platforms affect work. Asking the question, do platforms really provide new entrepreneurial opportunities? So the first reading for this week comes from Juliet Schor and Schor Vallas, who are two sociologists of labor currently based in the United States. And they basically ask the question, what are platforms? How do they shape work? How should we understand them? What's going on there? So to just give you some background, platforms more broadly, there's different types. There's a book called Platform Capitalism by Nick Cernosek. It's actually quite popular, or at least, among people who care about these things. And, he defines platforms as any kind of information and communication infrastructure that connects two or more parties together, two or more groups, two or more individuals, right? And often the companies that own these platforms, these infrastructures, are able to extract a sort of rent or capture a certain amount of value of money. They make their money from making those connections between those two groups, right? So in the case of Uber, right, it's Uber owns the infrastructure, the app that connects two parties together, the driver and the hailer, the person calling for a ride, and Uber kind of makes some profit from basically taking a portion of the fee that's paid by the person requesting a ride. Now, if that is what platforms are in general, Schor and Vallas pose this question first. What kinds of work are we talking about when we talk about platform-based employment or employment related to platforms? And they say they're first the designers of these infrastructures, so the people who design and program these apps or the various kinds of infrastructures that support platform-based employment. Which, as we learned last week, is crucial to the gig economy. So there are the designers, the people in control of the platforms. There are what they call cloud freelancers. These are basically contractors who work, who are hired online, and then they do their work wherever they do it, and then they return their work to whomever contracted with them. Then there are people who basically do offline work, whether it's driving, as in the ride sharing, or cleaning, or other in-person services, but they are hired through the platform, but their work is mostly offline. Then there are people who work entirely online, and an example of this are Mechanical Turk workers, or basically they do what they call micro tasks, or small, simple tasks for which they're paid a few cents per task completed, and that's all happens online. So people will be paid to fill out surveys, or they'll be paid to clean data sets, or do other kind of very small tasks that are all online. That's an example of that. And then there's social media work, which you'll have to read about as part of your case study assignment for number 3. So people who make media content, social media content. Now, when they talk about, how is it that sociologists and other kinds of researchers interested in social life, how do they conceptualize platforms? How should we understand? How should we interpret platforms, right? We kind of know what they are. I gave you the definition. We know certain kinds of work that are affected by platforms. I just talked about that. But how should we understand what it is that the platform does, other than kind of connecting two parties together? Well, some people think of them as incubators for entrepreneurialism. This is something that is challenged, I think, very clearly by the second reading for this week, which we'll talk about later. Basically, in the incubators for entrepreneurialism approach, people would say, well, what these do is they provide a platform for entrepreneurship, right? And they enable more people to take control of their lives. This would be a rosy-eyed view of the situation, one that I'm not wholly in agreement with. In fact, I don't think that's an appropriate way to think of these things, but some people do, and fair enough, they have their reasons. Another way of thinking of it, thinking of platforms, is that they are a sort of digital cage. Just another mode of corporate control over labor. This is something, if you haven't guessed, I'm sympathetic to. But I don't think it quite gets at what platforms are. Still critical. They're sometimes considered accelerants of precarity, right? These are the kind of sort of a nitro-injected engine of precarity, pushing us all towards ever more precarious, ever more uncertain careers. Again, I am sympathetic towards this view of platforms. I don't think that that's correct for them to do. I don't think that that's right. But I do think that's a good way of thinking of what is going on when we talk about platform-based work. Or alternately, people say they're like institutional chameleons. What do they mean by that? That sounds kind of complicated. Well, basically, they just mean that dependent upon the particular political economy in which platforms exist, the particular set of economic circumstances and legal circumstances, right? That platforms, what they do kind of changes depending on what context you put them in. And I think, if you think of what we read, this actually kind of echoes some of the stuff coming from Grint and Woolgar, coming from Judy Weissman, this sort of, technologies are kind of a combination of the social and the material, or the social and technical. And in some ways, that's kind of what this institutional chameleon kind of argument is all about. But I think that even ignores the fact that in most, if not all, but pretty much all circumstances in which platforms exist, they exist in the context of a capitalist economy. And so they tend to follow a particular logic of extracting value from labor that is a crucial component of capitalist organization of work, as we learned going all the way back to the beginning of the class. So you have these four kinds of ways of conceptualizing platforms. In contrast to this, Schor and Vallas argue that platforms act as permissive potentates. What do they mean by that? Platforms retain centralized control over task allocation, over data collection, over pricing services, and revenue collection. At the same time, they delegate control over work methods, how one carries out those tasks that are assigned by the platform, scheduling, and performance evaluation to workers, and in the last in terms of evaluation, onto consumers. This permissive power of platforms operates by first externalizing costs that are borne by or carried by conventional firms, such as ownership of technology. And typically, platforms shift these costs onto workers while capturing value from workers' equipment, skills, and data. Second, platforms offer an open employment relation that reduces or eliminates selection criteria. They're not really subject to the same kind of problems of hiring that you encounter in other employment contexts. Although, as Rosenblatt showed, and as we learned last time, race and ethnicity and gender are still issues here. And third, platforms outsource evaluation to consumers, right? Think about when you use Uber, you have to rate them. That's supervision. You're being a little supervisor for Uber, right? You ever think about that? You ever think about what your reviews might do to people? How it impacts their livelihood? Well, that's something you can think about this week. Okay, so in conclusion, when they talk about permissive potentates, Basically, what they're saying is that platforms exert kind of centralized control in some ways, but in other ways they're quite permissive. They allow a fair amount of autonomy, but at the end of the day, the things that matter, how you get paid, control over when and where you work, are oftentimes still subject to control by the corporation. And I think this goes back to last week when we were talking about classification, and basically these things that platforms still have control over, those are usually taken to be key indicators as to whether or not someone is an independent contractor or a regular employee. And if we were to evaluate platforms, most platforms at least, along those criteria, it seems as if platform workers should be classified as employees and should be given all of the full labor protections associated with that, and full rights of organizing as unions or in other kind of collective groups that come along with that classification. What do you think? Let me know what you think in the discussion questions, and I'll see you next time when we talk about Uber. Bye.